This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Welcome to the Friday morning break with John Gibbs, and this week I'm live in the studio as we explore my experiences through the guests of 2024. I look back on the year, and with the help of many expert guests and a few clips I've lined up, I ask, what have I learned in 2024? If you feel you've learned something and you wish to share it with me, message in.
This
Friday
is
morning
Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
And indeed you can this morning tune in and talk it out if that is what you wish to do. For unlike my shows of the last year or so, most of them have been podcasts, although they've been pre-recorded, and go out live, but not me actually live, as it were. So this morning I am live. I'm here sitting in the studio, which I think of as Northampton Media Centre, otherwise known as my garden shed, which is where I am right now. Now, I'm looking back on the year, and I've got some clips of some of the guests I've talked to this year. Now, you may know, if you've listened to my show on a Friday morning, that, or indeed as a podcast, which is where most people find it, you may know that I've been exploring what schools are for. Now, why is this? It's because the exploration of what schools are for, which I've been conducting on Teachers Talk Radio these last 2 years, has been part therapy and part a genuine inquiry, because I taught for quite a few decades. I actually managed to teach, I think, 38 years in the end. I retired at 63 age of 63. I don't know what else 63 would have meant when I think of that. And I was going to go on to 65, but the pandemic came along. And like a lot of people, I thought, well, maybe it's time to stop teaching. Actually, a very wise decision. My advice to you, by the way, is retire as early as you can. Not good advice in an era when there's a teacher shortage, but retire as early as you can. It's been very enjoyable, actually, being retired. I had a very happy and enjoyable career. And looking back on it, there were times when I thought, really? They paid me to do this? This is ridiculous fun. And there were times when it wasn't like that, when it was deeply, deeply stressful. Maybe more towards the end in some ways. Hard to know. Maybe that was the pandemic and so on. But I can't help admitting that as the years, 38 of them in teaching, rolled by, I increasingly wondered what exactly it was I was doing. Partly because the subjects I taught, politics, history, English, cultural studies, and so on, tended to cause a certain reflective view, engender a certain reflective view, I should say. And so when I retired, I thought, well, it would be handy if there was some sort of platform where I could vent a lot of these thoughts on what schools are for. Well, why was I wondering what schools were for? Well, you may think it's a rather daft question, as one of my guests thought this year. And I wondered what schools are for, because they try to do so many things. They're an ill-defined unit. We're very confused over what schools are for. Well, are they to prepare people for jobs? Are they to give the skills our economy needs? Are they to socialize the young into ways of behavior? What are those socialized behaviors that we most admire? Is it critical thinking? Is it being able to express doubts about the world you live in? Or is it to fit neatly into the world? So that tension between socializing so that you can fit in, and yet on the other hand being critical of the world you live in, probably one of the oldest tensions in education. Also, it's a sorting and sifting mode, and I increasingly worried about that sorting, that sifting, that pressure of data collection and so on, which seemed so prevalent as the years went by. And I must admit, I wasn't all that happy with the way education had indeed developed over the years as I taught them. So looking back, it was part regret, part not regret of my career, by the way, partly regret of what had happened to education and what seemed to be happening in schools. And so I take a critical view. Anyway, In 2024, this is my second year of Teachers Talk Radio, I must admit I've interviewed a lot of expert guests because I want to know from people who have carried out research what schools are for. So this year, for instance, I talked to a wonderful guest about accent bias, Dr. Christian Ilbery. And we talked about the way schools how used to make judgments about how you should speak and how you should speak, i.e. the accent, and how that fits in with things like oracy. I talked to a teacher from the Falkland Islands, Sebastian St. John, a man who'd gone to the Falkland Islands from this country to teach in a system that was separate and so different, and yet, of course, full of all the things that we might face in schools generally. Hannah Robinson talked to me about humour and how you use humour in education. I talked to Dr. Neela Chowdhury on international schools and what it was like to teach in a very impressive school in Washington, D.C., the Washington, D.C. International School, I think is what it was called. I talked to David Thomas, OBE, and he said to me, and we argued whether or not, we didn't really argue actually, we discussed whether or not teaching, asking the question, what schools are for is a waste of time. His point of view being that this is all very well, but actually what you need to do is talk about how to teach effectively, how to do the job in its most effective way. And indeed, we sort of know what that is. And so we disagreed, in a sense, over that, but mostly agreed. As curiously, when you find people who disagree with you, you find out you actually agree with a lot. Well, and I had some really wonderful guests. There was also Dr. Cleo Doyle, who's just at the moment publishing a book on Taylor Swift, an academic study of the words and lyrics and poetry of Taylor Swift, very apposite of our times. And what we discovered there, of course, is that she's a wonderful entry into poetry and learning. Some of her songs being about things like, well, Shakespeare, for instance, crops up quite a lot in Taylor Swift. If you've ever listened to her songs, you'll discover that that's true. Then there was Dr. Isabella Ora, who had, in part of an experiment, visited a school in the United States, which had converted the whole school into a Hogwarts theme. And, well, that was fascinating. A themed school, not just a themed lesson or a themed term, but a themed school. Every aspect of the school was a Hogwartian experience. Well, there were others, and I apologise if you were listening to this and you were a guest and I haven't mentioned you this year. And there are a few now which I'd like to explore with you through looking at them as some clips. So I'll add the first one now. I'm managing the technicals here on my own, so I'll just add this one. Right. Earlier this year, I talked to, small gap, dead air there as I get
when I was at school.
Whoops, there we are. First technical. That was Dr. Esther Leslie about to start talking. Now, Dr. Leslie, Esther, is an academic at Birkbeck College in London. And one of the reasons I wanted to speak to her, and all my guests in a sense, the ones that I've picked out for you this week to listen to, all of them had something to say about the nature of education in a way that was sometimes troubling. In other words, I felt it was necessary to hear the things you didn't necessarily want to hear. Dr. Leslie and I talked about, well, I'll give you the title of the show that week. It was Our Schools Are Failing and It's Nothing New. And one of the things she talked about was the growing sense of instrumentalism in teaching. And this struck a chord with me because I noticed over the years, I don't know if you've noticed this in your teaching career, that parents and other teachers and students in particular had increasingly focused on an idea of what things could be measured, what outcomes could be achieved. So much so that, for instance, I noticed as I taught A-level politics and A-level history and A-level English and things of that kind, that very early on in their journey, and the GCSEs I taught, very early on in that journey with students would ask me, "Is this in the exam?" is this in the exam, John? They often did refer to me as John, because at the school for most of my career I taught at, teachers were referred to by their first names. John, they would say, is this in the exam? I also noticed that if I replied no, this was some digression of a kind, which I thought was useful, but was part of their broader understanding of the subject, but wouldn't actually appear in the exam, then they often stopped listening. Well, I don't stop writing, but they stopped listening as well. Students would increasingly ask me, from day one of the course, can we see a copy of the exam paper? Literally the first week of a new course. Can we see the exam paper? Well, the students were aware that they were now customers in a neoliberalist system where they were expected to be critical of the kind of value that they were likely to achieve. Will we get the grades? And they'd been told early on in their career that this was what education was all about. And here, from 1st of March 2024, is Dr. Leslie talking about her experiences and her research in education. Oh, that's not working. That's great, isn't it? The first clip that we started to hear a moment ago, it's actually frozen. So I'll just try that again. See if I can get that back working again. Dr. Esther Leslie. It's great stuff, isn't it? Oh, we have a little freeze on the system. Hope this doesn't continue, since my whole show this week is essentially me.
When I was at school,
there we go.
Countless people would say it was my English teacher who turned me on to the world, to politics, to all sorts of things, because it was through reading books that something opened up. And I've seen with my own children how it really doesn't seem like that anymore, at least not within the state sector as I've experienced it. So how do we get to reason, to being reasoning, rational, critical individuals in the world without that reason just being instrumentalized and funneled into one end, one answer, one way of thinking and doing things in order to pass this exam? And sitting here in what was significantly an English department at Beck, we feel all too sorely how disastrous for us and for the humanities more broadly that change within schools has been, to not getting any students anymore. And this will lead to, and already has led to, closure of departments. And then that becomes no longer a possibility for lots of people who, in contrast, my daughter now, is at university and decided to try English literature again. And it is that thing that it was at school, think for yourself. And, so that enjoying that revelatory capacity of it should still be there. It should be available to 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. When I was at school, countless people would say it was my English.
And there we are. That was Dr. Esther Leslie. I'll get used to cutting those off at the right moment shortly. And that was from March, my show, March of 2024, where we talked about schools are failing and it's nothing new. In other words, what she sees as baked into education is something of a contradiction between its demands that can never be fully resolved. I was struck in that clip, I don't know if you were, looking back at my own school career and my own as a pupil, that was, back in the 1970s, and encountering A-level English literature for the first time. And I liberated, as it were, to talk with teachers about books. And many of the early books we talked about weren't on the syllabus, as I was explaining earlier. In those days, you did a lot of reading around the topic. So you didn't always say this was the one that you'll be facing. Of course, as the exams approached, in the second year particularly, it became a lot more intense. And you had to learn how to write essays and learn the quotes and things for the exam and fill up textbooks full of notes in the margins, etc. But what I discovered in English literature was, and I think Esther Leslie expressed it so beautifully, was the revelatory experience in that the great works of literature, and indeed any great literature, can have an antagonistic force, which is both liberating and at the same time extraordinarily powerful in engendering a critical view of the world. Well, in a sense, that's what I tried to do as I explored my teaching, as I went through my teaching career, was to look at different ways of engendering critical thinking in students. In other words, I like to think, and if any of my ex-students are out there listening to this, I liked to think that what I was doing was troubling them, leaving them a little bit perplexed and a little bit less certain that the world they lived in was exactly as the way it might appear to them. One of the things I used to say is probably this would be like something like student. Yeah, I remember Mr. Gibbs, John, you used to say this a lot. One of the things I used to say to them was,
why are governments...
Oh, there we go. He's setting the thing off too soon again. One of the things I used to say was, if a thing appears like common sense, if a thing is ordinary to you, if people present that as the way things are, that is probably where power lies in our system, both in education and generally in society. Question the ordinary. Question the world as it has been presented to you. Now, this was the 17th of November. Back in the 17th of November, actually not very long ago, actually. 17th of November, I'm dodging around a bit here. In 2024, I took part, as I often did in this year, in another aspect of Teachers Talk Radio, which is the Sunday Morning Review. And the Sunday Morning Review, if you haven't listened to it, goes out on YouTube and on Podbean, of course, and all those other platforms, is a delightful discussion by teachers with years of experience from primary school to secondary school about what was in the news that week. It's a sort of update, a sort of review of the week. It's only half an hour long, so you're not committed like you are this morning to this hour of me going on. And instead, so what seems to happen, but basically what you have, what I've learned, is there's a wonderful crew of colleagues who have a distinctly anxious view, like I do, about the ways teaching is going, and they respond critically and thoughtfully about the news. So catch up on the Sunday Morning Review on Teachers Talk Radio. Now, one of the voices you'll hear, that you can hear two voices now. One is Brent Poland and Lucy Newberger. Check my notes there. Brent Poland and Lucy Newberger talking about the importance of critical thinking.
Why are governments wanting to turn us into little robots? Why are they afraid of highly developed people? Brent, can I come to you on that first?
If I was cynical and I was Orwellian about it, I'd say a highly critical society, highly educated society is harder to control. No more example than somebody sitting with you right now who's probably a nightmare to manage. Why is that? Because I was imbued with the questions that my parents always kept asking me, why? I know that as a social scientist. If you have an educated workforce who demand higher standards, then the people in charge are going to have to up their game. And I think, unfortunately, across the Western world, I don't think this is a UK-wide. I think if you look at the United States, you look at that, there's a definite social media I don't know what to call it, a dumbing down of society, and yet a higher accountability for people like ourselves, but not those in charge. There's a definite scenario there. And also people are being encouraged to be polarized, stop thinking for themselves, adopt other people's opinions. As you say, we don't listen to experts any longer. And we as a profession are vulnerable because we are critical thinkers. We are people who sometimes went into education because we want to answer the questions. We are curious and we want the curiosity in our children. I love it when children put their hands up. But I might turn into a child and say, I'm sorry, I can't answer your question now because according to my lesson plan, I'm 6 minutes behind and I've got to ask you 16 retrieval questions. Got to make sure the evidence is in my exercise book, because when Ofsted come in, they will say I've done a bad lesson, even though you've got probably a very pertinent question to ask. But no, I've got a no hands up policy now because I'm instructed to have a no hands up policy, and I'm going to ask you to put your hand down because we've got a no hands up policy. That's what's happening.
Just the anxiety of you running through that, just... Yeah, I mean, it's the silence and compliance thing again, isn't it? It's, if you have got a sort of a cookie cutter set of people, then it's nothing changes. Nothing. There's no, and I do actually think, and this is probably a bit controversial, but I do think in many ways a revolution is coming, because it has to, because there might not be many of us at the moment, but I do think there are rumblings happening where people are thinking, well, hang on a minute, this is actually a bit crap, and this is actually not right. But it's kind of finding those other people and getting together and saying, we need to change. And in order to enact change, we need to, there needs to be, as history will tell you, there needs to be a lot of you, and there needs to be a lot of noise, and there needs to be a lot of, actually you are wrong, and actually it does need to be done differently, because otherwise we're just going to kind of sort of blindly continue zombieing forward into, well, I don't know what.
Why are
I love that. Blindly zombieing forward. So that was Lucy Newberger and Brent Poland. And the other voice you heard was Paul Hazard doing his brilliant job of chairing the weekly review. So keeping us all in order and presenting us with the questions. Well, so don't miss the weekly review on Teachers Talk Radio fairly regularly. It's a wonderful, wonderful exploration, critical exploration. Now, what they were both talking about there, what Paul and Brent and Lucy were most exercised by, was the feeling that in education, one of our most important functions is to give students that critical antagonistic force. I love the idea thank you for that, Lucy, of the revolution being near. I wonder if that's true. Certainly we are living in strange times, so anything certainly is possible now, it seems to me. Well, as this point in the show, it's probably a good moment for me to look at, where are we going now? Yes, getting a word or two from our sponsor here on Teachers Talk Radio. If I can just line this up now. Yes, the sponsor on the sponsor on Teachers Talk Radio is about to happen, and here it is.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Parent Kind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
Are your teachers juggling multiple technology platforms and struggling to keep everything organised? Then Toddle might be the answer. Built by a team of ex-educators, Toddle offers an all-in-one solution for teachers that streamlines everything, from curriculum planning and assessments to communication and report cards. And the best part? Toddle comes inbuilt with an AI assistant that helps teachers save time and improve their practices. 85% of schools replaced 3 or more platforms when they brought in Toddle. Teachers using Toddle say that the platform helps them save up to 10 hours a week. That means more time for what really matters, supporting students and driving academic success. See how Toddle can support your school. Visit toddleapp.com.
Hey education changemakers, ready for something special? It's Bet Show's 40th anniversary and we're throwing a free celebration just for you. Join us at London Excel from January 22nd to 24th to connect, learn and be inspired. Picture this, 300 plus speakers who truly get it, 600 cutting-edge edtech companies and all the fresh ideas you need to make 2025 your best year yet. So why wait? Head to uk.betshow.com, grab your free ticket and come celebrate with your peers. Because this is for you. See you at Bet.
I think there is a couple of...
Well, that was a word from our sponsor and on here on Teachers Talk Radio. So you're back on Friday, the 13th of December with John Gibbs here on Teachers Talk Radio. Once again, live in the studio, broadcasting to the world. And I can already see I've got a very substantial audience of listeners joining me this morning. And if you missed this show, of course, you can hear it as a podcast later on. What am I doing this morning? Well, I'm exploring what schools are for by looking back on 2024 with the help of some of the guests that have joined me on the show. So now I'm going to look back at a guest I had in May of 2024, Dr. Edda Sant from the University of Manchester. Now, Edda had been researching and writing about democracy for education, or education for democracy, how to educate students to take part in a democratic society. Well, that is, in a sense, that may be the theme of the early part of my show this morning. What are schools for if it isn't to fit it, to take part in, that is, a democratic society? Now, one of the ways in which we might answer that is say, well, we do. We have citizenship education and we teach them about Parliament. And for years I taught politics, which contained a big element of, how bills go through Parliament and how laws are passed and all of those sorts of things. The mechanics of education. And that citizenship education, is that the same as educating students to take part in democracy? Or is it closer to what Brent and Lucy were talking about, that you needed the critical view of society, that to take part properly in a democracy, you also needed to be able to stand outside of that democracy and observe it in a manner which simply wasn't as a sort of acceptor that this system is the best system. In other words, to take part in democracy, you might well have to ask, what is democracy? And is this actually a democracy we're living in? So one of the questions I asked Dr. Sant from Manchester University was, what is the difference between citizenship education and taking part in democracy and educating for democracy? And here we go again. This is Dr. Sant talking in just a second.
I think there is a couple of important differences. Well, first of all, citizenship education, there is some forms of similar courses to citizenship education, we can call it political education and so on, that are not necessarily the per se attempting to promote democratic values. So you can have actually forms of citizenship education in a dictatorial system. You can certainly have those. So to me, that's a very clear difference. And to an extent that sometimes when I talk about citizenship education, I even talk about education for democratic citizenship to emphasize that the democracy part is there at the core. Of course, in England, citizenship education is citizenship education in the context of democratic society. So in that respect, that difference doesn't exist there. But there is context where the difference exists. I think the second main difference has to do with citizenship education is usually quite explicit about the teaching of politics. It's usually about talking about politics, and it's usually about facilitating political knowledge, political values. It's extremely explicit. And it tends to be, not always, but it tends to be having some sort of allocated space and time in the curriculum, like in a sort of discrete subject sort of way. In contrast, democratic education is not necessarily like that. Many people would argue that democratic education is not that much about teaching about democracy, or even though teaching for democracy in terms of promoting knowledges and values and attitudes and so on that would be expected from democratic citizenship. But it's also about teaching through in terms of embedding these democratic values through teaching. So a lot has been said that democratic education can happen as much in citizenship education as that can happen in math education or English or obviously history or any other subject. Because when you facilitate possibilities for young people and children to have an opportunity to have their say, to influence what happens in the context of the school through school councils or school assemblies or so on, this is also forms of democratic education that it might not be explicit teaching about politics, yet you are trying to facilitate that your people experience democratic ways of life. I think there is a couple of important differences. Well, first of all, citizenship education, there is some forms of similar courses to citizenship education, can call it political education or so on, that are not necessarily the per se attempting to promote democratic values. So you can have actually forms of citizenship education in a dictatorial system. You can certainly have those. So to me, that's a very clear difference. And to an extent that sometimes when I talk about citizenship education, I even talk about education for democratic citizenship to emphasize that the democracy part is there at the core. Of course, in England, citizenship education is citizenship education in the context of democratic society. So in that respect, that difference doesn't.
And there we are. I think we managed to hear not only Eda talking about democratic difference between citizenship education and democratic education, we managed to hear it at the beginning again as well there. So as I get used to not looping my clips quite so enthusiastically. Well, yes. So the point she makes is a very important one, that education for democracy can be embedded throughout the school culture. Now, an awful lot of what comes up on Teachers Talk Radio is about school culture and how to develop school culture. School culture is one of those things we think we know what it is, and maybe when you experience it, you say this is a strong school culture or this is a good school culture. But actually, when you try to define it, it's altogether more difficult. Can you teach democracy and democratic values and critical thinking through mathematics and science and geography? Yeah, well, of course you can. Absolutely, of course you can. And I'd be very surprised if in geography lessons there weren't a critical understanding of our use of the environment. In mathematics lessons, the use of statistics and a critical view of what statistics can and can't say. I'd be surprised if that wasn't true. Now, as I set up for my final guest before here we go, fiddling around with things again. Before you can tell that I really can't multitask here, can't you? I really need a producer, someone who can find things for me and set them up. There we are. I've got my next guest lined up. Before we take a break for the Teachers Talk Radio news, I'm going to share with you another clip of one of my favourite guests. I'm sorry to the other guests, they're all favourite guests. What a privilege it's been to be able to talk to people with so many wide and varied views of education over this past year. Well, my next guest that was a guest of mine, he's actually the only guest to have been on my show twice in the last couple of years. And on the 6th of September, 2024, I interviewed for the second time a man called Dennis Sherwood. Dennis Sherwood is a systems analyst and a writer and an advisor to governments and an author of some fairly excoriating analysis on our examination system. Now, Dennis has been, among the many other things that Dennis does, campaigning for a better understanding of the reliability of exams. Exams, what a theme that is in our education system, in the tail that wags the dog of schools, exams. Well, when we look at exams, whether you have nightmares about your own exams and you imagine yourself in exam rooms, unable to put pen to paper because you haven't actually studied anything, apparently that's a fairly common dream among people. Whether you have that dream or you look back at schools as a teacher or as a young person, you suppose, I think, that whatever we could say about exams, the one thing we would say is that they are reliably marked. And it would indeed be somewhat disquieting to imagine they weren't. Dennis can fairly convincingly prove to you that A-levels and GCSEs in this country and I suspect around the world, but certainly his analysis of this country, are not reliable. They are generally only reliable to one grade either way. Now, I remember results days, happy times, most students achieving the grades they wanted, getting them off to university, getting them out to jobs, getting them on their apprenticeships, getting them moving into the sixth form, whatever hung on that grade. And of course, every year there were students in tears. And there were students who hadn't made it onto a university they'd set into a course, or at a university they'd set their heart on, or they weren't going to be able to study the courses they wanted to go on to study, or they weren't going to be able to get that job, since so much hung on GCSE English or GCSE Maths or an A-level A star as opposed to an A. A simple grade, a mark, a letter on a piece of paper had changed the direction of their lives. And yet, as I say again, as Dennis will prove to you, A-levels really only work reliably to one grade either way. What Dennis is about, what you're about to hear Dennis talking about, is one of the other misperceptions we have in education. That is, well, at least if you thought the grade was wrong, couldn't you appeal? And Dennis is now describing that even exams appeals are not quite what you think they are.
So I Google how many grades are changed as a result of an appeal. And indeed, I invite anyone listening to this to go to your laptop or whatever and just do that. Because when you Google that or search that on another engine, you'll come across a website. It'll probably be at the top of the list, which is Ofqual's official statistics. And you'll see a box. I'm reading that box now. It says that for the summer 2023 exams in England, we're only talking about England, and we're only talking about GCSE, AS and A-level. This is the data set that is available. Beyond England, BTECs and so on, not really part of this discussion. So anyway, I'm looking at this website, key headlines, and I read this. The number of grades changed for GCSE, AS and A-level as a result of an appeal is 710. Then goes on to say that there were 6.3 million grades awarded, so the number of grades changed on appeal is around 0.01%. That's what it says on the website. I, as a parent, what am I going to think when I read that out of 6 million grades awarded, 710 changed on appeal? What's going to go through my mind? It also means to me that, if I were to appeal on behalf of my kid and put them through that anxiety, yes, the likelihood that it will deliver an outcome that I want is pretty low. So it's a huge disincentive. This, to my mind, is hugely, hugely misleading. But it happens to be true. So no one is saying anything false, but there's a lot going on in that single statement which needs unravelling. And the first thing is that word appeal. We have used the word appeal since we started, and it's what any normal person is going to think they should do if they're concerned about a grade. But it turns out in the land of Ofqual, the regulator, an appeal is something very, very special indeed. And that's not what you do if you're concerned about a grade. So an appeal, the word itself, is hugely, hugely restricted and isn't what you would do as a parent or a student. So what you actually do is you challenge. If a student or a parent is concerned something has gone wrong, the first thing they have to do is to talk to the school, because only the school can take any action. You, as a parent or a student, individually can't do anything. You have to go through the school. So what the school does is the school then contacts the exam board. That is the outfit that organised the exam. In England, it's OCR, AQA, or Pearson Edexcel, the brand name of the exams that were sat. And what they do is they raise a challenge. It's not an appeal, it's a challenge.
Yes, okay.
And what a challenge does is it triggers a whole set of processes, but that process rolls on and rolls on and rolls on and rolls on and has an outcome. And that outcome might be confirming the original grade or changing a grade or whatever. If you are still, as the parent or student, unhappy with the outcome of that big process, you then appeal to the exam board to say, exam board, review what you have just done yourself, so they are self-policing, and take another look. And if you are unhappy with that, you can then escalate that further to Ofqual, who look over the exam board's shoulders. So what Ofqual call an appeal is right at the end of the IM&P process and counts only those very few people who've got the tenacity to go beyond that first stage of the challenge to take it to an appeal. Yes. So it is true that only 710 grades actually got changed right at the end of the process. But if you go back, you will find that the number of challenges is much, much bigger.
And there we are. That was Dennis Sherwood, who was explaining there how even in the exam system that we have in this country, an appeal is not an appeal. And the numbers they give, which suggest that most exams are highly accurate, is profoundly misleading. In fact, what you have when you hear the word appeal is an appeal of an appeal. So when you hear the number of actual appeals that take place, it's a filter. The number of exams that are contested is much, much, much higher. On another occasion, Dennis explained to me, as I said beforehand, why A-levels and GCSEs are generally only reliable to one grade either way. That is an extraordinary thought, isn't it? Since exams are such an important part of what we do in school and have become, increasingly in secondary school, almost the purpose of the school itself, to get good exam grades. And that's a terrifying thought, particularly since they may, as Dennis says, not be that reliable. Well, I think it's, as I look at the time now, time for me to play Teachers Talk Radio News and another word from our sponsor.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Parent Kind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
Are your teachers juggling multiple technology platforms and struggling to keep everything organised? Then Toddle might be the answer. Built by a team of ex-educators, Toddle offers an all-in-one solution for teachers that streamlines everything, from curriculum planning and assessments to communication and report cards. And the best part? Toddle comes inbuilt with an AI assistant that helps teachers save time and improve their practices. 85% of schools replaced 3 or more platforms when they brought in Toddle. Teachers using Toddle say that the platform helps them save up to 10 hours a week. That means more time for what really matters, supporting students and driving academic success. See how Toddle can support your school. Visit toddleapp.com.
Hey education changemakers, ready for something special? It's Bet Show's 40th anniversary and we're throwing a free celebration just for you. Join us at London Excel from January 22nd to 24th to connect, learn and be inspired. Picture this, 300 plus speakers who truly get it, 600 cutting edge edtech companies and all the fresh ideas you need to make 2025 your best year yet. So why wait? Head to uk.betshow.com, grab your free ticket and come celebrate with your peers. Because this is for you. See you at Bet.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week covers targets set by Prime Minister Keir Starmer to boost the proportion of reception pupils achieving a good level of development to 75% by 2028. Labour's Plan for Change also sets out how the impact of its so-called opportunity mission will be measured through attainment at the end of secondary school, but does not set a specific target. The focus on giving children the best start in life will be measured by improvements in EYFS profile results. This year, 67.9% of children were judged to have a good level of development across areas such as language, personal development and maths. The highest ever percentage was 71.8%, but that was under an old assessment system. According to data published alongside the pledge, hitting the target would mean approximately 40 to 45,000 additional children a year would need to reach the developmental goals. Research from the Centre for Young Lives suggests children who are not school ready are almost 2.5 times as likely to be persistently absent and 3 times more likely to end up as NEET. In a speech, the Prime Minister said hitting the milestone was an almighty challenge, as 1 in 3 children are not ready for school at the age of 5. Nick Harrison of the Sutton Trust said the target was absolutely the right ambition, but it will be a monumentous task. The government said its first step is recruiting 6,500 extra teachers, but ministers have still not set out exactly how they will meet this. Further details of the plans can be found on the Schools Week website and across media outlets. BBC News Wales reports that university fees are set to rise to £9,535 a year, a £300 increase, from September 2025. The Welsh Government's announcement brings tuition costs in Wales in line with a rise already announced for universities in England. It is the second increase in charges for Welsh courses within a year, after the maximum charge went up from £9,000 to £9,250 this September. A 1.6% increase to maintenance support for undergraduates was also announced. A government spokesperson said raising fees was necessary to ensure Welsh higher education institutions remain competitive. Further details and reaction can be found on the BBC News Wales website. Both the BBC and Schools Week also report on comments from Ofsted Chief Inspector Sir Martin Oliver on the issue of school attendance. Sir Martin has revealed he is worried about the rise of so-called flexi-schooling, saying Ofsted isn't able to get a proper handle on the practice. The Inspectorate's annual report warns of a rise in what it describes as unorthodox patterns of education. This includes a small number of schools allowing children to be flexi-schooled, where parents choose to home educate their children for part of the week. The Chief Inspector said he is very concerned that schools can record this as an authorised absence, which means Ofsted can't be sure how prevalent the practice is. He went on to say he has raised concerns with Department for Education and thinks greater safeguarding is needed. Sir Martin also made reference to an Education Policy Institute report which compared GP registrations with school records for children aged 5 to 15 and found that 400,000 children it might expect to see in schools are not attending. Further details on all of the comments made by Sir Martin can be found online. Plans by all 3 exam boards to introduce on-screen GCSE exams have been delayed due to disruption caused by the general election and the recent curriculum and assessment review. OCR, AQA and Pearson EdXL had ambitions for digital assessment in 2025 and 2026. Both require sign-off from the regulator Ofqual. But OCR has said it can't launch digitally assessed computer science GCSE despite making good progress on the qualification. Whilst for Pearson, they said giving the choice for on-screen GCSE English Language and Literature in 2025 is now unlikely. AQA had already confirmed a delay to introducing on-screen exams for GCSE Polish and Italian. An Ofqual spokesperson said it has not received any formal proposals for on-screen assessments. Ofqual and the Department for Education have been undertaking a feasibility study on what it would take to make GCSE and A-level exams fully digital. Finally, East Anglia Bylines reports that a group of French school children from northern France were left disheartened after British border authorities denied them entry to the UK due to a minor clerical error. The group of students aged 10 and 11 had been due to spend 5 days in the Scottish Highlands, but British border officials in Amsterdam stopped them citing incorrect information on the France-UK school trip travel information form. The form is mandatory since Brexit. The error was linked to passport and identity card numbers, reported in the same section rather than on separate designated fields. The group was forced to return home despite each student carrying a valid identity card, usually sufficient for entry under current UK-France agreements, as long as the school they travel with is registered with the French Ministry of Education. Since Brexit, French school visits to the UK have fallen by 60%. Prior to the vote to leave, French educational trips contributed an estimated £100 million per year to the UK economy. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
And there we are. That was, as she said, the wonderful Jo Fox and the Teachers Talk Radio News. You're back with me, John Gibbs, on this Friday morning, the 13th of December, as I re-explore the year of Teachers Talk Radio programs that I have been privileged to be able to make and broadcast and podcast over the last year. And we're looking back at many of the academic guests and experts and teachers and some parents who have taken part in my show as guests. And I thank them all very much for contributing over this last year. Well, what an interesting array of news stories there were there from Jo Cox. Flexible learning, not something that Martin Oliver welcomed. Well, there we are. Don't be flexible. That's the main message there. And young school children being cut off from coming to this country after Brexit. Well, there's so much we could say about that. And indeed, we do live in strange times. And those illustrate that very, very nicely. Not all my guests this year have been exploring the darker side of education, such as the unreliability of exams or the increasing instrumentalism of students or so forth. Others have looked at an aspect of teaching, which I think we've all experienced as students and as teachers, and that is humour in education. Being able to make students laugh, being able to use humour in all sorts of ways in education can be some of the most important ways you can allow people to remember things, or make people remember things, or bring people to remember things. So using humour in education is one of the most useful tools. And I don't know if you remember being at school and there was a particular teacher that you were delighted to know was going to teach you that afternoon because the lessons would be full of fun and humour. Well, my next extract is from a PhD researcher called Hannah Robinson, who was and is currently conducting research into the use of humour by teachers and how it is experienced by pupils in schools. And she's conducted numerous visits to schools and interviews and exploring this. And then what she was doing was breaking humour down. I imagine that humour in schools was simply about, do you make your students laugh? But of course, there's another side to it as well, a darker side, the sarcasm that might appear in teaching as well, and also the ways in which humour can be used as a sort of way of surviving, that gallows humour, that way in which all of us get through our teaching day by joking with each other in the staff room or with students. How is humour used? Well, one of the ways it's used is what Hannah called affiliative humour. In other words, to build a sense of identity and strength of identity among students. And this is Hannah Robinson in August 2024, talking about the use of humour in education.
Any humour that's being used that's positive, it's building relationships, it's socially acceptable, it's an uplifting, positive humor. So these styles as well, I think it's important to remember that they're not distinct individual styles. Like I'm using affiliative humor, I'm using course related. There is that overlap of using them at the same time. So if I use a positive joke, it's going to be either related to what I'm teaching or not. So it's going to be more than one of those styles in the classroom.
That idea that I remember, well, and many teachers will identify with this, that feeling that you could get the class to think of themselves as your class, or you and you had some sort of relationship. So you'd say to them, 3B or something, you lot really drive me mad or something. And they would know that it was a sort of joke because you were that class. You were building a sense of you were their teacher in your room, like having eccentric sorts of things in the, if I were to twist this camera around, we could see a cardboard cutout Donald Trump, which would be rather alarming, which used to stand in the corner of my politics class. And students would come in and they would go, "Whoa, what is that?" It's a life-size Donald Trump standing there. And they knew that it was slightly daft to have them there in order to facilitate a sense of this being Mr. Gibbs's classroom sort of thing. And we're now in that space with him.
I love that. That's brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. Again, that example, again, using that kind of positive, you're trying to make them laugh. You're trying to create this, positive, fun atmosphere. So yeah, it would be that
affiliative humor. And the other voice you heard, of course, was me sharing, as I often do with my guests, my own experiences. And indeed, as I look around my office or my shed right now, I can see a large life-size Donald Trump staring at me, which I rescued from my classroom when I retired. That feeling of going into a teacher's room and knowing that you were in that teacher's space, you were experiencing that teacher's personality, really, in eccentric sorts of ways, was part of bonding with the teacher, but also bonding as a group and a class, which again gives the lie to that teaching can be something that you can simply do by following a formulaic method. And one of the things we've talked about on Teachers Talk Radio on the Sunday review of late is the increasing sense in which many schools are directly telling teachers how to teach. This is the 4-part lesson. This is what you should start with. This is how you go ahead. These are the opening lines you should use. In fact, scripted lessons. There's nothing scripted about that experience of being in the class with another person and you're trapped for 2 hours or an hour or 45 minutes and you have to listen to them. And if they are engaging and if they're exciting and if they're enthusiastic, you'll remember it for the rest of your life. I mean, that's an experience I've had where I've been out and about in the world and encountered one of my ex-students from years before, and they've seen me with great delight, which is curious, really, that students often are like that. When you see an ex-teacher, you're delighted.
Sort of more serious side, if you.
Oh, I was getting my next clip rather previous there, so I'm not quite used to the technicals. And they'd be delighted to see you. And Mr. Gibbs, John, wow, are you still? And they always say that as well. Are you still teaching? As if that's incomprehensible. You might still be embedded in a way that you're actually carrying on doing that thing you do. And yes, I'm still teaching, and so on, you say to them. And they then say something like, either they remember a trip you went on, or they remember the day that something weird happened in the classroom, the day there was a leak in the roof or something, or they remember some stupid joke that you said or catchphrase that was a particular aspect of your teaching. It made them feel that they were in your classroom and they were experiencing a journey that was unique to them. And it wasn't just an illusion, because, of course, it was unique to them. You can never quite recreate the experience again. Well, this topic of school being fun and school being a delight came up at Teachers Talk Radio Weekly Review on the Sunday Review. And here is Lucy Newberger extolling the value of embracing the mess. And I think that's a good place As we approach the Christmas holidays and a new year ahead, I call upon teachers to embrace the mess. So let's listen to Lucy on the Teachers Talk Radio Sunday Review.
The sort of more serious side, if you like, in terms of kind of writing up investigations. You can introduce that later on, but why not use things like melting ice lollies, sitting in the dark, mucking around with things? That's what creates the joy. That's what creates the wonderment. And that, to me, is so much of what's missing from this curriculum at the moment. It's music to my ears, as you can imagine. I mean, we've talked at length about sort of what kind of teacher I am. And I love kind of getting involved with all these things and messing about, but also encouraging teachers to actually embrace the mess a little bit and embrace the fact that it's, science doesn't have to be perfect, particularly at primary level, and allowing children to sort of understand that it is a bit mucky and that you can get things wrong and that, it might be a bit sticky and a bit messy. And I'm sure there are teachers that are sort of thinking, they're going, the prospect of kind of getting messy is absolutely horrendous. No, it isn't. This is great. I think fantastic. I'm absolutely here for this.
I saw everybody nodding there, and I think we're all sold on it. I wish I were back at primary school. It'd just be great, And you talk about playing with trucks on different surfaces and learning about fantastic. Now, they do admit, John, that this is about building science capital. So behind, the headlines and the ice lollies and the superb articles by Michael Rosen and so on, does that serious side detract a little from what will be enjoyable lessons?
Well, I sort of don't mind if it does, really, in the end. I think if the student remembers the great, wonderful game we played, but can't remember why we played it, well, hey, that's part of that. It'll build. There'll be layers of other things. It'll get there in the end. Not everything has to be measurably achieved something. What have you achieved? It's that sort of walk into a classroom, every student must be learning and know what's going on. Not necessarily. A bit of bafflement's not a bad idea. And if a bit of bafflement's not a bad idea. That was me, of course, talking earlier in the year about the proposition that teachers should embrace the mess. Well, I think that's a reasonable way to bring this show, Teachers Talk Radio, to an end, as I have reflected on the year. Oops, I'm getting a bit previous again. I've reflected on the year from Teachers Talk Radio and my guests, and I could have mentioned other guests as well. Naomi Eisenstadt, the founder of and virtually originator of the Sure Start program. I was delighted to talk to the Prison Education Service earlier in the year, and you can find these shows on the archive on Teachers Talk Radio or look back on Spotify and other platforms. Well, I think I'm getting used to the technology, although I still mess it up from time to time. It was very enjoyable to talk with you, if you're listening, about 2024, the schools world, the education world, and the lessons that I've learned in my exploration of what schools are for from my expert guests. I thank you so much for this experience, to my guests, and to you listening this morning, and to those of you who come across this rambling escapade through the months of 2024 with me, John Gibbs, as you find it on a podcast. I hope you do, and I hope you enjoy it. I've certainly had fun this morning. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.